If you've been following this podcast for a while, you'll know that I'm a big fan of education and fighting misinformation. We've done a number of episodes on misinformation over the years with people such as Colin Walker from the ECIU. But one area we haven't covered in detail is the national press's approach to this. If we look at social media, it's easy to see that there are a number of loud voices on there that appear to be influencing a lot of other people. The number of comments that talk about similar things, the cars weigh too much, they burst into flames, that the batteries die after 3 years, is too much to be a sheer coincidence, which means there's a concerted effort from certain people to try and knock EVs back. There's a case to say that a lot of this is funded by big oil, although for social media, I don't have any empirical data to support that claim. But when we come to the mainstream media, the influence is a lot more obvious and traceable. Hi, I'm Gary, and this is EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. Many thanks for joining me today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, hit the little notification bell. You know all the normal things. Thank you very much. On today's show, we'll be looking at EVs in the media. Last year, friend of the podcast, Dan Caesar, posted something which showed the disparity between public sentiment on EVs and the media sentiment. Now, I'll quote from his post. Whether it's by accident or design, a few members of the UK press represent unreliable narrators on electric vehicles and renewables. I am at pains to point out that this is not the majority. In fact, there are many EV expert journalists, many of who work for newspapers named, but what unites the others is that their lack of real-world experience of EVs. The post then went on to show how various different UK newspapers position themselves when it comes to being pro or anti-EV. I'll link the post in the show notes so you can see for yourself. I do want to point out here that I'm not talking about articles and posts that point out flaws with EVs, although if you're pointing out flaws but not also pointing out the similar flaws in ICE vehicles, then I'm probably going to be taking issue with that. I'm talking about publications that will post one-sided, inaccurate articles that sow confusion and misinformation. But DSMOG, an organisation that charts and catalogues climate disinformation in the media, did point out a few years ago that papers such as the Daily Telegraph were hosting editorials and articles from journalists who were linked to think tanks in Tufton Street funded by the Koch brothers in the US. These think tanks were climate denying, and hence the articles were very much anti-renewables and EVs. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are several UK publications that seem to be posting more and more positive articles. The Guardian is one, and I did an interview with Jasper Jolly from The Guardian last year for an article he wrote on buying a second-hand electric car. I also note that previously negative publications such as the aforementioned Telegraph and the Daily Mail are also starting to post fewer and fewer negative stories about EVs and climate, although anything that involves somebody's poor experience with charging or travelling long distances is treated exactly as you would expect it to be treated. But I want to talk today a little about the role of the mainstream media in EV uptake, and to do that, I'm joined by Tom Riley. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers to find and pay for public charging with confidence.
My name is Tom Riley. I produce a electric vehicle newsletter called The Fast Charge. It's very much focused on the sector itself. It's read by businesses, it's read by journalists and investors and policymakers.
Fantastic. We will come on and talk a little bit more depth about the newsletter a little bit later on. But the main aim today is mainstream media and EV or climate misinformation. So tell me a little bit about your background in media so the listeners and the viewers know what your bona fides are, please.
So I have spent the last 11 years or so in various different communications roles. I actually have done the opposite of what most people do, is where they start in journalism and then they go and make quite a bit of money lobbying and doing PR. I started in PR. So I was in government communications service for the best part of 6 years or so. I left during the pandemic when I was at HMRC, and I was also covering roles in the Treasury and with the Cabinet Office. A really intense time, as you can imagine. And then I went to the private sector. And when I went to the private sector, working at agencies, I started working with car makers, I was working with energy firms, startups in the space. And actually, I just wanted to learn about this sector that we're in. And I just started the newsletter from there as a side project, really. And it's just grown and grown. And about a year ago, I thought, you know what, I'm going to have a go at taking this full time. And I suppose now I have morphed into a journalist. So I've not had any proper journalist training, but, you know, I've actually found it remarkably easier. Maybe having the comms experience and media relations experience for the 10 years beforehand has actually helped.
So I think when we put this out, I'm going to put a little subtitle under there. Tom Riley, accidental journalist. Would that work for you?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very true.
If we look at the way media portrays the two main key things that I'm interested in, which is climate change and vehicle electrification, it looks at first glance as though there's something of a delineation. There are those that are misinformers and there are those that are informers. Is it as straightforward as that, or is that too much of a black and white, or is there a lot more grey in there?
I would probably frustratingly say that it's quite a grey area. I think ultimately, if journalists, especially journalists at big publications, like publications under News UK, like The Times, The Sun, Sunday Times, and then, you know, others like the Mail. Ultimately, a lot of what journalists write is based on what people read and what people go to. That drives like everything, because essentially they're businesses at the end of the day. So if people aren't reading the stories, then, you know, they're not worth doing. And certainly when I started covering this space, which obviously I started covering it because it got a lot of attention. I remember writing a first article about EVs for a pokey publication called Drive Try, which was set up by Jeremy Clarkson, James May, and Richard Hammond. Since, I think, has disappeared. But I remember writing about EVs, and 50% of the people commented underneath going, "These are rubbish, they're never going to take off or anything." And then 50% of people were going, "Oh, actually, you know, I've got a Tesla and I save this much a month." I thought, actually, this is a great area because, you know, you've got these two different sides. And I think that's why a lot of the time you see these really mad stories in the past. You know, my electric car drove off without me like putting any feet or acceleration on. And I think we get that because people read it and people want those stories. And I have heard in the past a business editor at the Daily Telegraph who, you know, they love EVs. They love it more than probably anyone else because they write about them so often because their audience go crazy. And it is driven by that. But, you know, there are people that should maybe sometimes be a bit more stable, you know, especially the public broadcasters, so BBC, you know, whenever you see something on there in the past that hasn't been totally positive, you think, well, actually, you know, you're paid to give that impartial, factual view. And all journalists should be factual, but not all of them always maybe understand the facts, especially if you're, you know, the Mail. I once heard this crazy statistic that a journalist at the Mail Online was having to pump out a story every half an hour. And that doesn't leave much room to maneuver on citing sources. Often you just have to go with what's in front of you, you know, what's in Google, and, you know, deal with the aftermath later. So, yeah, I think it is a bit of a grey area, but I like to think that, and I do think that compared to 5 years ago or 6 years ago, whenever I started writing about EVs, it is a lot better. There are still the occasional stories, but I do think it's a lot more balanced. And actually where there are stories where people go, these are not so good because of X, Y, Z. There is some there's evidence to it. Like it's an actual survey that's been done rather than just make believe stuff. But there's increasingly a lot of positive stuff because the audiences are changing. You know, the Times increasingly now is doing quite positive stories and reviews, and I think that's because, you know, if you're a Times subscriber, you're probably in that bracket of people more likely to own an EV. So why would you alienate your readers?
But having said that, they have been doing that for quite a few years. And I'm trying to get my head around the fact that you've got what I assume to be fairly intelligent reporters working for someone like the Times or my personal bête noire, the Telegraph. Now, they're not all going to be climate deniers. They're not all going to be anti-EV. So why are so many climate denying or anti-EV articles ending up being published? Is it because they're being told, I don't care what you really think about, do this because we need the clicks? Or is it a case of they're all submitting, 2 or 3 articles a day, and the management, the editors, are only picking the ones that are anti-climate or poor climate science or denying nothing? How do you think that's working?
I think a lot of journalists are only in, they might get a role and they might jump around to different beats, as it were, in their careers as they go up the ladder. And I think it's actually increasingly very few journalists, especially because of, that whole market has been shrinking. Very few stay in one area. I think the trajectory for most journalist careers, you either start as a local reporter, then you go to a national maybe, or you start in trades and then you try and get to a national. And you're having to cover quite very maybe in-depth areas throughout your career and do them well. And often that means that you've got to cultivate your sources and you have to do that fresh. And, from a PR point of view, if I didn't want something to happen, you look for the, someone starts a role and you get in there and you start talking to them and you're giving, your lines. And I do think that, I see it in my inbox all the time. People always want to push something, which is fine. If you're a business and you're doing something, or you don't see the benefit of a policy or something like that, then you try and advocate for that. And I think there are some journalists who, maybe are a little bit swayed by the last person they've spoken to, but I think a lot of it is driven by, what I was saying earlier, is by that sort of the pressure to put something out. So maybe actually they're thinking, okay, this person's saying this, there is some reasoning behind it, I will put it out, I'm going to get clicks, and I need to do that for my boss and for the editors. And then there's actually, the editors themselves. A journalist may write a story, but then it basically goes into a machine, especially if you're a newspaper. The sub-editors or editors might be changing the headlines or making, tweaks or challenging, what about this angle? What about that? Before anything, you have to pitch your story. They might go, oh, well, I know, X car maker has said they're going to bring out this charging network. What do we think? The editor might go, I don't know whether that is actually a story. But it would be a story if you had X, or or you were going to talk about this, or you had this kind of opinion. Those sorts of conversations happen. I'm very lucky in the sense that, and I think smaller publications are, because I can basically, when I'm pitching to myself. I only have to satisfy, my own itch, and there's a lot more freedom there. And I do feel sorry for a lot of journalists who I think want to be writing, other stuff, but have a lot of pressure, especially when they're more junior in their career, because you just want to, like everyone at any business, you want to you want to move up, get better pay, progress.
The flip side to that is, and the example I like to use is Giles Coren. Now, a number of years ago, he wrote an article for the Daily Telegraph. It was about his Jaguar I-Pace, and it wasn't very complimentary. Now, I knew Quentin Wilson quite well, and he and I have talked about this, and he knows Giles Coren. He's spoken about this. He said Giles is very, very much pro electric vehicles. He loves them. He thinks they're great. But he still ended up writing an article that was fairly negative. And obviously the reasons are, as you've just said, his editor has probably said we need it pitched this way and that way. But what was also interesting, and I'm not sure whether you knew about this, about a year later, his wife also wrote a very negative article about the I-Pace, which was effectively a rewording of his article, and she just tweaked it a little bit to make it sound as if it was her who'd actually written it. And I have a problem with that. I have a big problem with why they're doing that and what they're hoping to get out of that. Is it purely clicks?
I think it is. I actually, one of the first interviews I did in my newsletter was with Giles Corrin when he had written something about it was probably his iPace. And yeah, he was actually, he was very open with his time. He was actually very frustrated, I think, more so with like the technology stuff was very frustrating for him with the iPace, and I think some of the support he had from JLR. So I do think he had to go and hunt down his own car at one point. But some of his frustrations actually were frustrations that I think most people in the EV industry have. He was very frustrated with charging networks. He said a lot of stuff about a certain network source who he said a lot of stuff that I couldn't actually publish because it was almost like defamatory. But he had those actual normal frustrations. And I remember when he did that story, he did like another story after I interviewed him a bit later about getting rid of the iPace and, EVs aren't going to work, etc. And I did contact him and he was like, actually, he got a Zoe. He still had an EV. He wrote that and he still actually had one. And I'll probably get it wrong. I'd have to check, but I'm pretty sure he said that he loved his car. Oh no, it was either a Zoe or he got an i3. There was a car that he got which was smaller and he loved it. Maybe it was an i3 rather than a Zoe, but it was certainly a little small hatchback of the time. But I think it is purely clicks. So when I started writing, or started getting very interested in writing and journalism, one of the people that I used to read a lot of was A.A. Gill, who was the Sunday Times restaurant critic and occasional columnist. And I watched a lecture when this was very early days, I was trying to get, very much into my sort of press career and understand journalism a bit more. And he gave this lecture and he said, really, you want to have a big post bag. That's what you want with your stories. And I think it's very true. When I joined consultancy after being in government comms, there was a really great senior person at the firm I was at, Teneo, who had come from the Sunday Times as one of the kind of sub-editors. And they said the way to know what an audience of a paper is thinking is look at the letters page, because that's where you can see the stories that matter to people, because it's all about the post bag at the end of the day. That's old school. Obviously now it's kind of probably emails and tweets, but that is what they're looking at. When Giles, or I think it's his wife Esther or something, did that, it's probably because actually it performed very well. I do that. There are stories I have repeated several times because I know that they always do well. I also have a TikTok account, and whenever I do anything about pavement channels, it gets tons of views because it's something that I think everyone sees or has an opinion on or can have an opinion on. It's very accessible, and I think with EVs, everyone kind of, even though they've maybe never driven one, everyone thinks they can have an opinion on it because it's green and it's environmental, and we all know what tree huggers are like, and that's just like how it's been in this country for decades. And I think that's kind of where a lot of it comes from, because people kind of want to hate them even if they've never tried them, but then people get into them and that all changes.
It is bizarre. But what he does bring up is, I've got a question here that talks about the lack of balance in many publications. And if I try and link that back to what you've just said there, you can put something out about pavement charging and it will get, a lot of response. You can put something positive about pavement charging or negative about pavement charging, and it will still get response because it's the topic itself that's the issue. I could be wrong, but I think the way you frame it won't have that much of a difference on the number or the type of comments that you get. That there'll be it will have a marginal difference, I would imagine, unless I'm wrong about that. So why, what is the incentive then to say something negative about it, given that the topic itself is going to bring in, the post bag, the clicks, the comments, etc.?
It's probably a case of, if you say something that you think is going to resonate with people. So, if we look at this week, Andy Burnham has come in. 50% of people in this country use buses. He's announced the £2 limit down from, I think, £3. clearly that is something that's going to resonate with a lot of people at that point of view of like on the side of the, the people using the buses. And I think it's the same, however small you go. If I did something, I do try and do positive stuff, but people inevitably come in with their own view, and you see it. And that's, maybe that we definitely should see more of that, because, if we were sticking with Giles as an example, if he'd written that story and said, I'm getting rid of my iPace. I've had it really frustrating. God, this EV stuff is all really hard. But I have actually just bought another one, a used EV, which is smaller. And yeah, maybe kind of would just make people go, what? Well, so what do you think? Like, I think people want people to have one view or the other. And I think that's what, especially when it comes to media, that is very much like how, certainly editors think, and how, even I think that I always like try and have to end it on something. So, you have to kind of end somewhere. You have to point in one direction. I think even though it'd be great to have the either or, I think actually everyone knows that a story has to go with one sort of direction. But that's why we need things like, places like the BBC, where we really should be having that information. And there should be, at the moment, obviously, especially when it comes to like EVs or renewables, the main view from people is that, they don't like it. They don't know why they don't like it, but they don't like it. But actually, maybe that's because the audience for those people is much bigger than the audience of people who have tried it, have it, get it, and want it. I hope, and that's why things like the Z mandate are really important, and why our ambitions in this country and everywhere else should be like stay and throttle up, is we'll have more of that audience who are going, no, actually, you're wrong. And then you'll get more journalists going, okay, I need to write for this audience, which, as I said earlier, I think that's kind of what we've been seeing with articles like, like from the Times and from other publications that are slowly being a bit more, actually, these are all right. The Sun, I think it was a couple of years ago, awarded the MG, like one of the MGs, like car of the year. I was like, how does that make sense? But I think that, they're probably in a very mixed situation now, where they're like, well, we have people who they're going to benefit from them because they're cheaper to run. But also we've got this other audience that we've got who, really don't like them. And yeah, I wouldn't like to be at a big publication. So I think it is probably very hard. I think actually the people who really should always get it right, and I think they do, is like trade publications, because they're in it and they are important because, I suppose I am a trade publication effectively, and you do get read by other journalists in your space or who might touch on your space. And that's where they will get a lot of their views from, is, reading about the topics, not necessarily from businesses direct.
See, the problem is, if we loop back to the Giles Coren discussion, I read the article. Like you say, he brought up some very, very valid points about the state of charging in London. And I don't think that it's incumbent on journalists to try and sort of push things like that under the carpet. I think that there needs to be a good conversation about, because, it's not perfect. There are issues in certain parts of the country with certain parts of the infrastructure, with certain vehicles. There's a whole manufacturer who makes a whole set of EVs, and I won't go anywhere near them because I just don't think that they're worth it. And I'm not going to say who they are, but they're pushing for some weakening of the Z mandate. That's all I'm saying. So I think there is a... Well, it could be, but we won't go there. Other than to say, I spoke to the head individual at that company at a conference a while back, and I said, why don't you have plug and charge on any of your EVs? And he turned to me and he went, what's plug and charge? It's kind of, ooh, right. So that tells me all I need to know about your involvement with electric vehicles. Yeah. But we digress. I think there have to be articles out there which talk about the negatives as well as the positives. But I think one of the problems, or one of the things that I've seen, is the headline doesn't match the article. So, you'll have a headline going, EVs waste of time, survey says. And when you read down, there'll be, they surveyed 1,000 people and 4 people said, no, I wouldn't touch them because they're a waste of time. And they've picked on that one particular tidbit of information and made that the whole story. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on that and how we can combat it.
So I have seen that a lot, and it is often very tabloid, like a very tabloid approach of getting people in, literally like it's clickbait. And yeah, I've seen a lot of it, and I don't agree with it. But in the other thought is actually sometimes you do need to have something at the top of your story that, you know, brings people in. That's the thing, actually, when I write stuff that I fret about all the time, and I'm always annoying my girlfriend, or, you know, my brothers or my friends, and going like, so I've got this story, like, what do you think is this bit interesting, or am I just like, it's not very interesting, is it? And I did a story last year, and it was about, I had a load of the consultation responses from car makers to the consultation last year, and just there was this really odd line in one of Jaguar Land Rovers around the car for the Prime Minister couldn't be made electric because of a bomb risk. And I just thought that's, you know, that is quite funny, but clearly it's just a side thing. You know, he is one person, but I thought, actually, he is just one person, but people will be drawn in by that. You know, that's, you know, it's quite funny. And then you can get to the other bits, you know, and the rest of the documents, which is, you know, just what I did. But a lot of people took that and just wrote silly stories about, you know, he can't have an EV because they're not bomb proof. And I was like, it's kind of like, maybe not really what I wanted, but it was, you know, it made me laugh. Though things like that are important, because ultimately, if I do a really important story, so if I did, like today, the story I've done today about car makers lobbying for the end, effectively, of the 2035 ban, if I hadn't done that as the headline, if I'd just written, I don't know, car makers upset, then people might see that in their inbox and think, I knew that. So you do have to think about those things. They are important, and sometimes you have to be you never lie, but you have to be, you know, I'm often Googling words and think, what's another word for, you know, this?
But I think that brings up there's an important distinction there between this is what the story says, and I need a headline that brings people in so that they will read that story. And this is what the story says, but the headline doesn't actually reflect that. And I think I've seen a lot more of, in certain publications, I've seen a lot more of right, this is the headline that people are going to read. But because they've read that headline, they're not going to go underneath and read the article itself. With your publication, because people subscribe, it gets delivered in their inbox. It doesn't really matter what the headline is to a greater or lesser extent, because it's in their inbox and they're going to read it anyway. So there's very little of the issue of having to sort of entice them in. If they go to the app and they're reading through, you know, 1,000 different articles from 1,000 different authors, then yes, I think there's sort of something that needs to be in place to make sure that happens. But, you know, it's just one of those things that's, it's important to make sure that there is definitely a balance there between what's in the article and, you know, what's in the headline. Do you think that balance is getting better?
Yes, I do. I think that a lot of the time now when I read or I search for stories to include in my publication, or if I'm just reading generally, I do think it is a lot more balanced. I think where the headlines and stories get dramatic is basically the people who are giving clearly comments, or, you know, the time when you're talking to a business, or, you know, a source, it's on background, so you can't, or off the record, so you can't ever use it. And that's where, you know, people, I can't remember the exact phrase, but, you know, people tell you their true thoughts and opinions. But that's where, you know, I think a lot of drama can come from. You know, I love it. You know, I love a bit of a gossip. You know, I think most people do. But that is probably where a lot of, when it doesn't look like it's balanced, or it looks like a story is edged in a certain way. I think that's probably where a lot of it comes from. You know, I do a lot of getting correspondence and trying to get forwarded lots of things, and you can see that in what people are sharing to whether it's politicians or whether it's to media. And I can totally understand why certain people have certain views. And then there's also the other thing. So especially if you're a journalist and you've got a lot of that coming under you, so to speak, like a lot of people pushing stuff to you, then you have to kind of look at all of that and then talk to your editors or your publisher to make it make sense to them, and then obviously to your audience. So it is tricky, but I think eventually we won't call them, maybe we'll always call them EVs, but essentially they'll just become cars. I think that's what people want. And I think therefore the way we think about them will also get way better, and the way people write about them will get better. So long answer to your question is that yes, I think that the balance is getting better. Could always be much better. Could happen faster, but it is going up.
We know from articles such as one published by the website Desmog that a lot of the anti-EV opinion pieces in places like the Telegraph were coming from think tanks in Tufton Street that were ultimately funded by the Koch brothers. And I'll put a link to the article down in the show notes. Now, is there any sort of flip side of the coin to that? Can we have somebody who can provide some sort of funding that will sort of produce the opposite of that, pro-EV or pro-climate for a given publication? What do you think?
Absolutely, yes. It is totally possible. In my previous role, when I was a lobbyist, and one of the people I worked with was a guy who was an entrepreneur. He was he was in his 80s or 90s. He had a lot of money, and he'd funded loads of money to some of the Tufton Street places. The thing I worked with him on, he just basically put £1 million into a new think tank. He was like, make this think tank for me. And he wanted to get more like CEOs into government. Not totally, controversial, really. I think he just felt that a lot of the senior civil servants hadn't really had much private business experience. I think a lot of people agree with that. But it took us a bit of time, but he had the money, and you can pull stuff together. You can pull together reports. You can do polling. You can, take journalists out for lunch and share your view. They didn't necessarily have to agree with it, but clearly you go to the journalists you think will agree with you. You talk to politicians, and you can reach people, especially with those sorts of budgets, that maybe you could bring, you can like almost pay for academics. And at the moment, as well, there are so many people who are still in good health in their later age, and they might have done very, cool stuff in their career. They might have been like a former chair of a bank or something. So those people are kind of knocking around with time on their hands. So you can like pay them a day a week, and they'll sit on your board or be an advisor or reach into their networks. So yeah, it's totally opposite to do something like that. I think there are just quite a few less people who may be in this space or who care about it deeply enough. Like, I'm trying to think of people off the top of my head, but I can't, to be honest. There are a few out there, but I think that does happen. There's like Octopus Energy. They are behind, I believe, if I get this wrong, obviously, but Electrify Britain and that campaign. There's lots of big organizations which support groups like New Automotive. So there are like groups and organizations out there that are getting this, like putting these arguments forward. But I think certainly, the Tufton Street gang or whatever, they've been around a long time, and therefore they're so established, some of those groups. They have such existing relationships with editors and things like that. There is no reason, and based on, my experience directly doing stuff like that, it is totally possible to have the opposite. But whether people do it is another thing, because, at the end of the day, it does cost.
Let me sort of flip that question on its head. One of the publications which I think is very pro-EV, very pro-climate is The Guardian. Now, every time I read an article on The Guardian, there's a little thing at the bottom saying, please give us some money, please support us, which is, absolutely fair enough. What would happen if someone like the Koch brothers came in and said to The Guardian, we will fully fund you for the next 10 years, providing you change your stance on electric vehicles, climate change, and being pro-fossil fuels? Would they go for that?
In the Guardian's case, no, but so they just wouldn't, because it's their own. They already have billions or millions and millions of pounds through the Sutton Trust, I think it's called, or something like that. So they don't have to really worry. Obviously, they get money from people. Then I think that's great. I think journalism is really hard. I went paid last year. It's difficult. When I worked in consultancy, I can tell you it is much easier to get thousands of pounds out of a business than it is to get £8 out of a person to subscribe for content. It is really bizarre, but I think there are definitely publications out there, especially I think in the trade sector, or publications which are a bit squeezed, where you might be more open to sponsorship, and that's probably how it looks. Actually, it's it would be big brands. So like the Guardian Group, say they were. It was. I don't exactly know how it was bought, because it was clearly bigger than the publication that took it over. But it was like a long read publication whose name escapes me at the moment. But Tortoise Media, that was it, wasn't it? But Tortoise Media, they just relied entirely on big businesses funding their events, or doing drop-ins, and that's kind of how it works. You pay me some money, and I will, we'll run an event on your thing, because I think that's where maybe people become unstuck, because at the end of the day, everything is a business, as crude as it sounds. But I think there are some good organisations out there, like Business Green, for example. Their whole thing is about writing, I think, quite positively promoting this, these sorts of industries which are doing good. So I think it'd be a lot harder for them. Certainly, for myself, whenever anyone has signed up, and there have been some of the people that have paid for subscriptions are people that might not necessarily agree with everything that in the EV transition. You just make it clear. Well, I might have to criticize you one day. So as long as there are boundaries, then I think stuff like that is perhaps all right, or it should be all right. But yeah, it's when effectively you're being paid not to do something. I don't know whether it does happen quite like that, but clearly there are ways that it can happen, and I think it's more likely to be that where it's when people or businesses come along and they say, "Oh, we'll sponsor this event, or we'll sponsor," like Politico. I don't know if they do like a newsletter every day, and it's always sponsored by like Google or Meta, and that's kind of where they get their messages across. But yeah, it's tricky. Media is tricky. It's a hard business. It really is.
And I know you and I have talked at some point about the fact that you are going to end up at some point reporting on people in possibly a negative light, but you actually want them to support you at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about the Fast Charge newsletter. What was the impetus behind it? You talked a little bit about that at the top of the discussion, but go into that a little bit more detail for me, please.
So I started it because I wrote the first couple of articles on Drive Tribe, and they seem to be doing very well. And I thought, well, actually, I don't know why I'm writing for someone else and not really being paid for it. I'll just create my own. And I knew I was going into consultancy at that point anyway. I just left the civil service after a very long stint. I liked writing about cars. I like writing about exciting things, and it just looked like a great area. And I started writing about it with the mission statement of "I will not lust after Musk," which at the time, late 2020, early 2021, he was the only game in town. But I'd come from HMRC, where we were always told if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And that has always really stayed with me. Obviously, that was about, tax scams, but it's very true of all things. I think you should always be a little bit, you should be happy to praise something and criticize it. And that is how I have run the newsletter ever since. when it's the EV sector does some great things and there are some incredible people within it facing some really tough challenges. And sometimes my heart really does bleed for them. And, especially more recently when we've seen businesses disappear for really no fault of their own other than basically governments changing things all the time. But at the same time, like charging networks could be so much better. So many of them could be so much better. And it's almost like they actively choose not to be. And that really annoys me. And I will call them out on it. Because there are simple things, and that you can't go, I don't know why no one's getting into EVs when, there are stories going, I'm stuck and I can't use this charger and it's freezing cold. Well, whose fault is, why did no one think of that when they were putting in the charger? Wheelchair users can't access it. Why did no one think of this? Like, are you idiots? Some are brilliant, but I think that is how I have seen it. And from my experience in comms, which happened, for the 5 out of the 6 years or so that I've been writing about this, 5 of those were in consultancy. Only 1 has been when I've just been doing it full time. But when I was doing it as a sort of a side thing, these were the things I just would never understand. And you do have to kind of celebrate the good, but also highlight the bad.
And that brings us very nicely on to the day we're recording this, you released an issue of the newsletter. And the issue actually came out and accused car makers and the SMMT of trying to undermine the ZEV mandate by going around the appropriate minister and lobbying multiple ministers to essentially keep internal combustion engine cars after 2035. And you've got freedom of information requests, you've got letters that have gone into the DFT, etc. How did you go about thinking about that sort of story? What was the sort of seed that went, I'll send out a couple of FOIs and find out? Where did that come from?
I got some really good, I do a lot of FOIs, and I am probably not a favourite of many people in Whitehall departments, but I got some very good advice from the Times investigations correspondent, George, I can't remember, it's George something or other. Can't remember his surname at the moment. He was like, when you think of something, just get them in. He was like, I do like he does hundreds all the time. And for a long time, when I've been doing them, I've been thinking, well, maybe if I ask this, then I'll get some information back, which, will say this. But actually, with freedom of information requests, when you're looking at that thing, is you do kind of have to do a bit of a machine gun rather than a sniper rifle. And when I I saw those reports, as everyone in the sector did, around ZEV mandate changing, and given I'd already heard from people that officials were telling them expect some change you're not going to like soon, I thought, right, there's clearly something that's been going on behind the scenes here. And having been in comms and public affairs, I know that one of the standard approaches that organizations do, because you can never really just like phone up a minister, is you have to send in a letter or you have to send in an email, and that's where it happens. So there's always a paper trail, because often if you're trying to lobby government, you've got to go through the officials, and the officials log things. So I looked at which departments might be involved. So Treasury, Business and Trade, Department for Transport. I just put in some requests. You don't always know you're going to get something. I am sure that when I put in requests, it gets marked as this person often writes about what he gets. And so often I have to kind of really challenge, given that I now have, I think, a kind of a good footer that I always add, which kind of addresses. So I was like, if you're going to redact something, actually you need to look at this guidance, actually you need to look at that. So I have a good way of doing it now, where I think I kind of get as much as I can at the different stages. But it is, you don't always know what you're going to get. Often I get FOIs back and they just say, we don't hold that information, or that's not for us, or, actually it doesn't exist. Even though often I think it probably does exist, but I wonder how hard people ask. I've asked before on, WhatsApps between CEOs and ministers, which I know that they're good friends. Like, who doesn't WhatsApp? The government is a government of WhatsApps. Yet getting WhatsApps is impossible. I've never got any WhatsApps. I don't think I ever will get any WhatsApps.
Interesting.
People probably just do the disappearing messages. But if you're a big car maker, you have a big agency that may support you on communications. Big agencies follow standard approaches, which often is letters. Let's write it in a letter. So you don't always get very spicy stuff. It's always kind of written in, letter language, a bit formal, a bit, I would urge you to think about this. So that's why these letters, when they came back, immediately I thought these are, powerful, because they're using language they normally use. There was Stellantis saying, like, literally almost like blaming the welcome approach of China by the government. Then some of when you look at them and you look at the dates and you look who they went to, that's where you can pull things together. And often I will get FOIs back and I will sit on them if there's not anything there, but then one time something comes along and you think, okay, there's that, and then there was that. So everything ties up. Like the letters from Mike Hawes, I published 2 today, and at the time I got told, the government was really a bit annoyed, I think, to put it mildly, that the minister, Keir Mather, got put on the spot at the conference. And having been there, I thought he really did, and I thought he handled it very well. And clearly that was right, because in that letter, that it just kind of, that the vibe of that letter to him clearly came across. You didn't respond positively, but I appreciate it. So suddenly things like, actually you have more confidence in going and writing about stuff. So that is, I think it's very different. It is very hard, because a lot of the times I look at stuff or you hear a tip and it doesn't really turn out to be anything. But, as we've been saying, a lot in this conversation, that's why, I do think media is tricky to try and get the right balance, to try and form the right opinions. And you have to be so careful, because you get something wrong and people come after you. And, I wrote something recently about Octopus, and even though I had spoken to them and I was pretty clear on everything, I still got, an email in the morning going, you need to change the headline, you need to change this, you need to change that. I was like, no. I think they pointed out something from like Ofgem. It was like some publication that, no one, not even Ofgem people, have probably seen. So I updated that. But then, I think obviously I always want to be factual, and that's what I try and do, despite what a lot of people may think on some of the stories I've done in the past. But there was always this thing that the Times needs one source to write a story. The Financial Times needs at least 2 stories to write a story. I have always tried to have 3+, like 4, 5. Like, I need hard facts. So stuff like the letters, stuff where it's like, it's not my words, it's theirs. But yeah, it's fun though. But
100%.
But the story today is, for me, it was quite a big one, because I think we've always known that car makers have been dragged to this. They've always been dragged to stuff. They didn't want seatbelts. They don't want to change their, how they do things. And I think we've always known that. But this is the first time, certainly from my point of view, that it's been in kind of black and white. Actually, we want to keep selling internal combustion after this date.
Which is quite a damning indictment, really, on the state of the industry. If they're just, we don't mind polluting, we don't mind causing bad air quality, we don't mind the impact it has on the climate. We just want to keep selling it because it's easier for us. So anyway, our time has come to an end. So Tom Riley, thanks a lot for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate you chatting to us.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed it.
Now, I think that was a great discussion with Tom, and it just goes to prove that with many areas of mainstream media, the pressures being applied to journalists are quite intense and often produce the wrong results in the long term. It's also good to hear that a lot of the mainstream media are starting to come around to things like EVs. Tom's comment about the Sun newspaper discussing the MG as the best car whilst also trying to denigrate EVs was quite interesting, I thought. There's a link to Tom's newsletter, The Fast Charge, in the show notes. Please subscribe if you can. He puts out really good, really well-researched articles and materials every week, and it's well worth a read. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers to find and pay for public charging with confidence. ZapMap is free to download and use, with thousands of public charge points to choose from, live pricing and availability information, and a range of filters to find the right charge for you. Plus, choose subscription models for enhanced features such as using ZapMap in-car, on CarPlay or Android Auto, and discounted charging across thousands of charge points. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. It was put together this week with the help of Tom Riley from the Fast Charge newsletter. Many thanks for his time. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. Why not follow me there? Many thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks, So You've Gone Electric and So You've Gone Renewable. They're 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on Amazon. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, my stats show that a lot of people watch this on YouTube, but they're not subscribers. So if you're one of those, why not hit that button and the notification bell so you don't miss out. Thank you very much. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at musingsev.bsky.social with the words, paddling in the mainstream. Hashtag if you know, nothing else. And thanks as always to my co-founder, Simon. You know, he's been accused of being a Tesla lover. He's been accused of being a Tesla hater. He's certainly got some things to say about his Model Y that are not too complimentary. But the one thing he's always maintained,
I will not lust after Musk.
Thanks for listening. Bye-bye now.